Support for the Capital Connection comes from
United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org. And New York State United Teachers, representing professionals in education and healthcare, online at nysut.org.
It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm Alan Chartock. With us, Blair Horner, the Executive Director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, or NYPIRG. He's back again, and we love it when he's here because he knows more about state politics than anybody I know. Welcome, Blair.
Thanks for having me, Alan.
So, a topic that I wanted to get to with you is what's in our water. The New York State Department of Health's Drinking Water Quality Council recently announced its recommended levels of testing for PFAS levels in water supplies. The release of its long-awaited recommendations on PFAS was supposed to put New York at the forefront of drinking water protection, according to public health advocates. It doesn't. Tell us more.
Well, I mean, for people that live up in the Hoosick Falls, Petersburg towns outside of the Capital District or down in the Hudson Valley around Kingston, Newburgh area, they're unfortunately very familiar with this. PFAS is a chemical compound. It's a family of chemicals that were used to make, non-stick cookware, waterproofing for clothes, and for other reasons. And it's what's called a forever chemical. So it takes a long time for it to break down. And it ends up in drinking water supplies, usually outside of manufacturing facilities. It's also used in firefighting foam. So places where at airports, for example, in the Stewart Airport down in the Hudson Valley, where firefighters would test, particularly when it was a military base, would test, do their sort of practice for fighting fires that use foam, and it leaches into drinking water supplies. And so it's one of those chemicals that the health department has been looking at to figure out, well, what are we going to do about it, right? How do you know what's in there? How do you test for it? What are the levels at which you are concerned? And the health department is looking at a wider range of what are called emerging contaminants. In other words, drinking water supplies that are a problem in chemicals that can show up in drinking water supplies that are a problem. It's not just PFAS, but PFAS is one of the chemicals. And they came out recently with recommendations for testing and levels of concern that are higher than I think public advocates, health advocates would like to see. And that matters because we all rely on drinking water. We want to turn on the tap and be able to drink the water. And if we can't, that's a problem.
So I grew up in New York City, where we were constantly told that the water was better than anywhere else. Is that true?
Well, the drinking water supplies for New York City are from reservoirs, primarily in the Catskills, and then it's piped in these giant pipes that go from the Catskills into New York City. And so as long as those reservoirs are clean, and the city does not right now have big, gigantic facilities to filter the water like they have on Long Island, for example. As long as development is blocked and you don't have runoff getting into those reservoirs in the Catskills, New York City's drinking water tests very well. Areas where you have industrial legacies, PFAS, which we talked about, or other types of industrial legacies, often that can end up in drinking water supplies because in many places like Long Island, they drink groundwater, basically pumping it up out of underground aquifers. And if you have toxics on the land, it leaches down into the ground, and it can affect drinking water supply. So New York City's has been historically very good, and that's why there's no treatment for that water. But in other places, particularly in old industrial areas of upstate or on Long Island, there have been real problems.
So those of us who have been drinking this water all of our lives, and my life has been a little longer than most now, how screwed are we?
Well, again, it depends, where you live. And
I lived in New York City on 96th Street.
Yeah, I know. Well, it looks like you're going to make 96 at least. So that certainly has worked out for you. I don't think, again, emerging contaminants in drinking water supplies only adds to your risk. Generally speaking, people don't drink the water and get sick from it. There are areas of real concern. There are areas where there are elevated levels of cancers in particular because of contaminants found in drinking water supplies. PFAS tends to be one of those chemical compounds that can increase the risk for various types of cancers. So it is a real risk, and the important thing is for the public to know what the levels are so that they can advocate for themselves to make sure that drinking water supplies are as clean as possible. NYPIRG, for example, has on its website, nypirg.org, has a What's in My Water webpage where people can type in their zip code and find out what contaminants have been found in their drinking water supplies.
None of this sounds like I should take any comfort about what you're saying.
Yeah, it can be worse. You can be living in a part of the country where drinking water supplies are evaporating because of climate change. New York State and the Northeast tends to be blessed with lots of fresh water and lots of drinking water supplies. However, we have an industrial legacy that goes back 100 years, and these chemicals were not disposed of properly. And so now we're going to have to deal with those problems. On Long Island, as I mentioned earlier, they have very sophisticated filtration systems, and even then, sometimes the contamination levels exceed what people consider to be an acceptable level of exposure. So it's something that we're all going to have to deal with. It's going to be an increasing problem as the planet dries out because of climate change. And in places that have fresh water supplies, we're going to have to spend more money to make sure that the water is as clean as possible.
Now, I do remember having, spent a lot of time on Long Island, on Fire Island and Hall, that there was a soap problem. The soap would contaminate the drinking water. Is that still going on?
Well, Long Island has changed a lot from in the earlier days where essentially disposal was done on the top of the giant sandbar, which is what Long Island is.
Sure.
And everyone there's 3 levels of aquifers underneath Long Island's, the top of the land. And the first 2 levels now are pretty contaminated. Most wells that are drilled on Long Island go to the 3rd level. And for years, they didn't have a sewer system. I mean, people had cesspools in their front yards. And so when you think about the fact there are millions of people living on Long Island, and if you don't have adequate sewer systems or adequate systems of dealing with garbage landfills or toxic sites, it's going to end up in the drinking water. That's just the way it works. There are federal Superfund programs out by the old Grumman facility on Long Island, and federal Superfund sites are at the highest level of toxicity. And it is a plume now of toxics that are, leaching into drinking water supplies on Long Island. And there are state Superfund sites. It's all over Long Island. So Long Island, I think, eventually is going to have to come up with a different way of drinking water. And there have been discussions about hooking Long Island up into the New York City system because of the potential threats that exist to the aquifers.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about climate change. We have an Environmental Bond Act on the ballot in November. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, it's $4.2 billion the state would borrow and then pay off over 30 years like a mortgage. And the money is earmarked for various environmental programs, but primarily to deal with issues around how the state is going to adapt to climate change. And rising sea levels is going to pose threats to places like Long Island and the New York City harbor. There'll be more forest fires. There'll be a drying out of New York. There'll be bigger storms. And all of that, dealing with all of that stuff is going to cost money. And so the Bond Act at $4.2 billion is one way to sort of provide resources to the state to deal with it. And you're basically borrowing for capital projects to, elevate roadways or have, more storm-resistant culverts. And so, we think it's a good idea. We supported it. But it's, really it's only a tiny fraction of the amount of money the state's going to need. I mean, there were some estimates that came out from the federal government that in 2021, New York spent $20 billion in 1 year to deal with the various hurricanes and gigantic storms that impacted it. And so you're talking about, the $4.2 billion will be helpful, but it's not going to solve the financial problem the state's going to face as climate change continues to get worse, because that's what's going to happen. No matter what happens in terms of using electricity and everything else, it's going to get worse for at least some period of time, and it's going to cost money. The question from our perspective is, who should pay? The taxpayers or the oil companies? We think the oil companies.
I'm so surprised. From NYPIRG's website, nypirg.org, those of you who are listening can go there and find some very interesting stuff. Jobs for the environment. I know NYPIRG is hiring students, recent grads, and other passionate, motivated activists to work on community outreach programs for the urgent fight against climate crisis. Fill us in.
We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit, and we sort of organize ourselves to deal with problems with using the best science you can. And so one of the ways, since we don't make campaign contributions, we don't endorse candidates for office, often we're not even very nice to them when they get to be elected, we rely on people power to sort of, influence, to impact on public policy. And so we do a lot of work educating the public on the issues. So, for example, we talked a little bit before about drinking water, but we also educate the public about the impacts of climate change, for example, both financial and what are the policies that the state should follow based on best practice around the world in terms of dealing with climate change. So we hire people to do campaign work, essentially, to educate the public on the issues and to point them in the direction of positive solutions.
Let's talk a little bit about voting in New York. This week marked the deadline for New Yorkers to register to vote in the coming elections. Are the voting rules too strict in New York?
The short answer is they're stricter than they should be. Under New York State's Constitution, New Yorkers have a constitutional right to vote. And so there should be as few obstacles as possible. And yet there are obstacles. And sometimes they're in the laws themselves. Sometimes they're because people don't want the voters to vote. And you're seeing one of those fights play out right now where the conservative and Republican parties are involved in litigation to block easy access to absentee ballots while we live through a pandemic.
Why are they doing that?
And, it's a blue state. If you look at polling data, Democrats are much more likely to vote via the mail-in ballot, which is what an absentee ballot is in New York, versus showing up at the polls. And it's a lot of that's based on all the lies that have been put out by the former president, for example, about, corruption and all that kind of stuff, and, about mail-in ballots not being valid. But there are states that have only mail-in ballots, and they don't have any problems. They certainly no more than we do. And it's far more likely people are going to vote in the modern age than in the horse and buggy days when you had to ride your horse to the polling place at some place, on a Tuesday in November. It doesn't make any sense. So that's one example of where New York State, which has made it easier because of the pandemic and has used its sort of regulatory authority to define exposure to a pandemic as a rationale under its current state constitution, to allow people to have absentee ballots and to vote. And so that's one of the big issues. It should be easy. It's not. It should be easier. There are people that don't want it to be.
Now, I know that NYPIRG has been very interested in having college campus voting. College campuses are setting up polling places for students to vote on campus. Does this move the turnout needle for younger voters?
Well, under the theory that the easier you make it for people to vote, the more likely it is that they will, I think the short answer is yes. There have been some studies done that looked at the issue of when you added a polling place on a college campus, does turnout increase? And just as I say it, of course, everyone knows what the answer is. The answer is yes. But there have been some problems. Recently down in Dutchess County, for example, the Republican commissioners just prohibited the location of polling places at Vassar and Bard, despite the fact that state law now says that polling places have to be on college campuses if there are at least 300 college students registered to vote from the campus address. Now, again, I don't know if Vassar and Bard don't have 300 registered voters. I don't know. But there has been a history down there in Dutchess County in particular, but all across the state under the current state law that goes into effect this November for the general election day. Every college that has at least 300 registered voters in New York has to have a polling place. And we think that'll boost. And, voting is muscle memory. The first time people do it, it's always the hardest. And after that, people understand the rules and they make it easier to vote going up as they get older.
I mean, there's always practical politics behind all of this, but is some of this the fact that the Democrats know that the younger voters are more likely to vote for Democrats than Republicans?
I mean, our experience over the years has been that it certainly cuts that way, that younger voters tend to be more liberal than older voters. And so it's partly that. But we've run into problems where Democrats don't want young people to vote either in heavily Democratic areas because they're afraid they'll vote for the challengers, the Green Party types.
Absolutely.
And so it's not one party per se, but if you look at it in the aggregate in a place like New York, which is a blue state to begin with, younger voters tend to be more liberal than older voters. But when you sort of get down at the granular level, it plays out differently in different parts of the state. I mean, there's a reason why the agreement this year in the state budget to allow students to vote from their college addresses on this coming election day does not apply to early voting. And so yes, they're interested in making it happen, but they weren't so interested in making it happen in terms of early voting because of the logistics. I mean, the colleges don't want to have their properties tied up for long periods of time.
Okay, let's just say I'm a doubter that the Democrats know that the easier they make it to vote, the more votes they will get, the Democrats will get. And the Republicans know just the opposite. Is that true?
Well, generally speaking, in New York, yes. It's a blue state. The enrollment is about 50+% of enrolled voters are enrolled as Democrats. About a quarter are enrolled as Republicans, and a quarter are, everybody else, primarily people that are not registered in either political party. And so, in New York, and looking at it from a statewide lens, you would want to make it as easy for people to vote as possible if you're a Democrat, and easier to register to vote as possible. But again, it changes when you sort of get down at the granular level because urban areas where Democrats are and rural areas where they're not, it sort of plays out a little bit differently in terms of if you're in New York City, do you really want all these new voters to show up? Because if you do, you might be helping challengers. And so it plays out differently. There's not been pedal to the metal on the Democrats' part to make it easy for people to vote. Although, that being said, over the past few years, there have been a lot of measures that have passed that make it easier for people to vote. And New York's election laws have improved in terms of access for new voters than they were, say, 4 years ago.
Yeah, but if I'm a Democratic official, if I'm elected, I have to keep my eye on the prize here. I have to worry that screwing around with the laws and making it easier to vote will hurt me, even though theoretically it's supposed to help me. Do you follow this?
Sure. I mean, this is why one of the criticisms we have about the New York State election system is it's run by the political parties.
Yeah.
I mean, the 25+% of the voters that are not Democrats or Republicans, they have no say in elections administration other than who they elect to Albany to change the laws. It should be a professional, independent civil service system, and their job is to just make it as easy as possible because New Yorkers have a constitutional right to vote, and it should be simple and easy for anyone to register and to vote, and it's not as easy and as simple as it should be.
So why are SUNY campuses, I taught at SUNY for years and years, as you know, why are SUNY campuses facing such major deficits? Campuses across the system are reporting millions of dollars in deficits, including Fredonia, $16 million in debt, and Albany, where I taught, $15 million in debt. What gives?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is state policy. I mean, it was the deliberate policy of the Cuomo administration, for example, to foist costs onto the campuses and not provide state support to deal with it. So the classic example is the so-called TAP gap, the tuition assistance program. Up until Andrew Cuomo became governor, the informal rule was when public college tuition went up, the maximum tuition assistance program award would go up to match it. So if tuition went to $6,000, the maximum TAP award for the poorest students would be $6,000. And that way, the poorest college students that were eligible to be in college would be able to get financial aid and they'd be able to go.
But did that help the middle class? But did that help the middle class?
Well, it's a sliding scale, and so it helps up to family incomes of $80,000, and so you'd get less financial support the closer you got to $80,000 family income, and if you went above that, then you didn't get anything. So that system, the former governor changed to sever the relationship, and so he said, well, we're going to keep increasing tuition, but we're not going to allow an increase in the tuition assistance program. And the colleges have to eat the difference to make it up for the poorest students. And every year as tuition went up, that gap kept getting bigger. And so it was tens of millions of dollars. And so that's an example of the state starving the system in a way that, in terms of policy. On top of that, you've had a change in enrollment patterns. Fewer and fewer students are going to school. The capital costs of running a college are the same. And part of the rationale for why that's happened, of course, is demographic. There's been the 18 to 24-year-old demographic is shrinking as a percentage of the population. But the colleges haven't had the resources to reach out because there's a lot of 18 to 24-year-olds who'd like to go to college who don't. And so there's been I think a starvation strategy on the part of the state, particularly toward the state university, but also the city university system, that I think has hurt them financially and made it harder for them to adapt to a changing population environment. And that has to change because these colleges in some parts of upstate New York, they are the economic engine of that area, and starving them to death not only hurts the college and the students, it hurts the communities where they're placed.
Now, Blair Horner, let's talk about pay-to-play. Questions have been raised over campaign donations made to Governor Hochul by a small family-owned company during a time when they were paid over $600 million to deliver COVID tests to the state. But the governor says there's no pay-to-play going on. Are you shocked that this is happening, Blair?
Gambling in Casablanca? At Rick? I'm shocked. The whole system has always been this way. I mean, since as far back as I can remember, every governor has used every lever of control they have over state government to raise campaign contributions. And every governor, Mario Cuomo, George Pataki, Andrew Cuomo, and now Kathy Hochul do that. Where you get into problems is when it goes over the ridiculous line that exists. So we think that the current system is terrible and should be changed, but it is the system. And where you run into problems is like under Andrew Cuomo, where his top aides were directing government contracts to those who were making campaign contributions to the governor, and they got caught saying that.
Yeah, they got caught saying it.
Hochul can stay on the right side of the line if there's no clear evidence of a quid pro quo. Now, a lot of this stuff, the story, particularly on the COVID tests, is the state overpaid. It was to a big campaign contributor. Why is that? There hasn't been a good answer on that yet from the governor's office. But again, if her argument is that we were trying to get out as many COVID tests as possible, and we weren't able to do that unless we overpaid. So who knows if that's true?
Well, is she better or worse than the others who have had that job?
Well, she's been better at raising the money in a shorter period of time. But her political calculation, I assume, is she's willing to take the hits on this because she knows she's really not the incumbent. She's never been elected governor. Yeah. And she was going to face a well-financed opponent, which she does. Yeah. And, the rule of, campaign contributions is the mother's milk of politics. There's a reason why people say that.
Well, not only people, but the famous Jesse Unruh from California. He was the speaker.
That's right.
He's the one who first uttered that, as I remember, and I knew him well. Interesting. I did. Let's go here. The governor's race. We only have 2 minutes, but polls show Kathy Hochul ahead of Lee Zeldin. There were no debates this year, so ads will be primary way people hear about the candidates. It seems to me this isn't much of an election. What do you think?
Well, right now, the polling tells you the tribes are supporting their candidates, right? 51% for Hochul, 40% for Zeldin, and 10% undecided. But, again, she has never been elected statewide office. It's, it could be a red year. We'll see what happens in the elections. I mean, there were polling, as you may recall, Mario Cuomo against George Pataki in 1994. They had Mario Cuomo.
He was
going to
win.
Points.
Yeah, he was going to win.
Yeah, that's right.
And
so you never really know. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, New York is a bluer state than it was in 1994. Kathy Hochul's not a three-term incumbent. But the issue then that catapulted Pataki to victory was about crime and public safety, and that's the issue that Zeldin only talks about.
I only got a minute.
In terms of what's going on.
I only got a minute. I wanted to ask you very quickly about abortion. Will the abortion impact the midterms?
Well, I think it will, particularly in states that are, like New York, a blue state. I think people are going to be fired up on that issue. How that sort of compares with the crime issues are going to be I mean, the crime problem in New York that people talk about is the same problem all over the country, and a lot of it is related to what happened with the pandemic. So, we'll see how it all plays out, but it's definitely going to have an impact. Whether or not it's determinative of who controls the House, I think it's too early to tell.
Blair Horner, you are so smart, and we love to have you on with us. And we will be reaching out to you, you can be sure, in the future. We are out of time. Our guest has been Blair Horner, the Executive Director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, and we are so overjoyed when he can join us.
Thank you.